Chalo, so we are starting on a very important topic. We have completed on taxation. We will start today on the second part of taxation, and that is GST. Okay, very important topic for the simple idea because Indian constitution or the Indian taxation sphere went through a major revolutionary reform, much necessary reform that was pending from a very long time came across. This happened in 2017 as implementation, but the work started much before. So what is this idea? What exactly happened? What change that it bring about? What was the scenario before? What was the scenario after? These aspects is something that we will check. Okay. So what we are discussing is GST, which is nothing but goods and services tax, right? The government called it good and simple tax. The opposition called it Gabbar Singh tax, right? So was the government right? Was the opposition right? Were both right? Were both wrong? This is something that we'll try to understand. Okay, clear? Right, chalo. So first question that we ask as every time is the idea of what is GST? Why did GST become necessary? And when we ask why GST becomes necessary, we are looking at what was the scenario before GST and what was the scenario after GST, right? So that answers our question of why. So what, why? And then we go into the implementation. So in terms of, we are looking at the evolution, right? So the evolution idea of GST, then perspectively we are looking at the constitutional aspects. With this we will also touch upon the idea further specific of the key features. Okay. So once we understand the key features, differentiating it from the taxation system, we are also getting in specific where we look into some specific features of GST, something like compensation, right? The idea of a constitutional body called GST Council, right? We'll also look into the aspects like HSN code, GST network, right? These are some things that we will be looking in terms. So this is the overall idea that we are looking up. It's a very interesting topic, also a topic which is very relevant given that day-to-day life we experience this idea called GST. Okay, right? Now to the first part of the question. The first part of the question is what is GST? Right? In simple, we are looking at the definition, correct? So when we look at the definition, we are asking in how did GST change the scenario, right? When we looked at taxation, we said there are two types of taxes. There is direct tax and there is indirect tax. In direct taxes, we took examples which is income tax, corporate tax, property tax, wealth tax. As indirect taxes, we had the idea of excise duty, customs duty, then service tax, sales tax, entertainment tax, right? Your ideas of luxury tax, octroi, ee riti sakashtu taxes it. Okay, right? So all that were the idea of GST. Now, how did it become one? That's the idea that we are looking at. Okay, so to understand what of GST, we will have to get into a simple understanding of why, right? Let's take a scenario. I am an investor, probably within India itself, and I am looking at which place would be good for me to invest to start a business or to run my business. And when I look at India's map, I don't see India as one country, I see it as 29 different locations. Why? Yes, India became politically independent and then integrated 1947 and onwards. The social integration of India is a process ongoing, that we are trying to integrate India irrespective of the caste, creed, religion, region divide. But economically, Karnataka 20% tax, Andhra Pradesh 15% tax, Maharashtra 18%, Kerala 8%, ee riti, every state had its own level of taxation, correct? So from an investor point of view, if I'm a foreign investor, if I'm a domestic investor, from an investor point of view, if I look at India, there are 29 different Indias that I'm seeing. Right? So essentially, the biggest problem in the business scenario was we had multiple types of taxes and collected at multiple levels. Multiple types of taxes and multiple levels made ease of doing business horrible, and that had affected India's economy badly. Hagadre, was the problem only identified recently? No, the problem has been there. We have been trying to bring reform after reform slowly, by which we are trying to change the scenario. However, the problem existed. So, the one-point solution for all this was integrating all these taxes into one and then charging it also at one level. What was the problem? Multiple types of taxes collected at multiple levels, and that was creating a huge problem. Now, the one-point solution for all this was collecting all these taxes at one level or one point and integrating all these taxes into one tax. That is why, what was the slogan statement for GST? One nation, one tax, one market. Right? The slogan statement for GST was one nation, one tax, one market, because the whole idea was about integration. Remember when we did reforms of taxation in the previous topic? In that reforms, we said unification of taxes is a major reform necessary, especially for indirect taxes. So from that particular perspective, when we look at this scenario, right, it is important to understand of how GST brought a scenario of one nation, one tax. So how do we define GST? When we try to define GST, we say it's a unified indirect tax collected at destination. Right? So we also say it's a destination based unified indirect tax. That's the understanding that we come across when we talk about the idea of GST. Okay? So take a definition of GST and then we'll go ahead. Clear? So GST is a unified indirect tax. GST is a unified indirect tax across the country on goods and services. GST is a unified indirect tax across the country on goods and services and collected at the destination point. Collected at the destination point. Okay? Are we clear? Yes? Right? So, this is the basic understanding of what, where we are looking at a definition. Now, when we look at why, the idea of why is, why did GST become necessary? What made GST necessary for an economy like India? Right? Now, was India the first country to bring the idea of GST? No. France was the first country to come up with the idea of GST, and it was as early as 1954. Right? India was very late into GST. But the challenge for India was, India is, yes, a union, but from a political point of view, we have divided powers. So, Schedule 7, there's a union list, state list. So, constitutionally, we have divided powers to the states also. So, to bring a system like GST takes a lot of effort, taking all the states into confidence. That is why this idea took time. Right? So, better late than never, it has come. The initial idea when it came, there were issues that we will discuss. But now, it is one of the much necessary reform that Indian economy has seen. And you have been reading newspapers day in and day out of how GST collections have been continuously increasing and how that has benefited the economy also. Okay? It's a destination based unified indirect tax. It's a destination based unified indirect tax. That's how we understand GST. So, hagidre, what was the scenario before? And then, what is the scenario now? How do we understand the why aspect of GST? Okay. So, when I try to understand this part, there we'll get to see the idea as such. Okay. So, look at that. Specific, right? Let's take an imaginary scenario. First thing that you need to understand, what are the different types of indirect taxes? Different types of indirect taxes. Try. What are different types of indirect taxes? Like we said yesterday, there is something called excise duty, customs duty. Excise duty is on all manufacturing, customs duty is both import and export, right? Then we have sales tax, service tax, right? We have things like octroi, pretty old, right? Entertainment tax. This is at state level, okay? Luxury tax. With reforms, what was brought about? The idea called VAT. So just as an understanding, look at the number of taxes. Look at the number of taxes. And these number of taxes collected at different levels. At the level of manufacturing, at the level of sale, at the level of transit from one state to other. So, what was the major problem? The major problem was, in summarization, multiple types of taxes, right, collected at multiple levels. Multiple types of taxes collected at multiple levels. Right. So, one common term that we use to summarize this idea of multiple types of taxes collected at multiple levels is, what do we say as, cascading effect. Right. So, there is a huge cascading effect the economy was facing into, multiple types of taxes collected at multiple levels, and that was resulting into a lot many issues when you come into the idea of GST. Okay, clear? Yes. Let's take a practical scenario. Let's take a practical scenario. So, what is the scenario? Say there is a producer. Right, at the end there is a consumer. Right, there is a producer, at the end there is a consumer. Perfect. So, there is a producer, there is a consumer. Right. Now, let's take a scenario where the producer is producing a certain good which for him is only costing 20 rupees. For him it's only costing 20 rupees. Now, this has to pass to multiple wholesalers, retailer, and finally reach the consumer, correct? So, there are different levels. And from here it goes to the consumer. So, it is going to multiple levels. And each level there is tax coming in consideration. Right? So, what are the different levels? If you look at, there are wholesaler 1, wholesaler 2, wholesaler 3, right? Retailer 1, finally a retailer 2, through which it goes to the consumer. These are different levels. ಹೇಗೆ ಸರ್ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು? ಒಂದು ಹಳ್ಳಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬೆಳೆದಂತ ಕೆಲವು ಗೂಡ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ಪ್ರಾಸೆಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಫೈನಲ್ ಒಬ್ಬ ಹೋಲ್ಸೇಲರ್ ಪರ್ಚೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಆ ಹೋಲ್ಸೇಲರ್ ಇಂದ ಒಂದು ವ್ಯಾಲ್ಯೂ ಅಡಿಷನ್, ಫೈನಲಿ ರಿಟೇಲರ್ ಟು ದಿ ಕನ್ಸ್ಯೂಮರ್. ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಇಂದ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಮೂವ್ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಮಲ್ಟಿಪಲ್ ಲೆವೆಲ್ಸ್ and at each level tax of different types, right? And we have seen the different types of tax. Clear? So look at the tax burden that coming into consideration. You know what happens? Finally, by the time this good, which here is only costing you 20 rupees, by the time it is going to the consumer, right, it effectively becomes for a rough approximation, right? So effectively becomes 100 rupees. Right? Does the farmer or the producer get that benefit of that cost? No. Right? No, so much levels that you see taxes being collected. Do you see the tax collecting authority, which is the government, being benefited by this? No. So, in the system that existed earlier, neither was the producer benefited, nor was the consumer benefited, nor was the government benefited. Why? Because when there is too many types of taxes collected at so many levels, that led to what? Cascading effect. And what was the impact of cascading effect? What is the impact of cascading effect? The impact of cascading effect was there was too much tax evasion. Very difficult to find out. There is too much tax evasion. Right? With increased tax evasion, naturally what goes up? Fiscal deficit goes up. Right? And with increasing fiscal deficit, automatically your welfare expenditure comes down. Right? And employment generation affected. Right? The scenario of cascade effect was such that it decreases investments. And that also has further impacts. Right? No room for domestic manufacturing, no room for domestic growth, all that created issues. Right? We had no benefit to small scale industries, MSMEs, or also logistics sector, and all of them were very badly affected. Why? Because of such kind of an issue. So, producer, consumer, and the government, all of them are impacted. The previous system had issues to everybody. Now, we have brought a system where we have not eliminated this, but we have eliminated tax at different levels. We have brought a system where all this can be integrated and tax is collected only here. Right? So, we will see when we understand the system of GST, what has been the change that has happened from here to there. That is the ideation that we will catch it. Okay? So, what was the scenario before GST? The scenario before GST was, as we understood, there were too many types of taxes collected at multiple levels, and that was resulting into a cascading effect. And that effectively led to higher tax evasion, increased fiscal deficit, employment affected, investments affected, ease of doing business being very low, attracting investments wise. MSMEs affected, right? Logistics sector affected. Overall, for an economy like India with such large diversity, such large regional spread, the system of taxation was not in any way benefiting. Who were getting benefited? The middlemen were getting benefited. Why? Because there was a large scale tax evasion and they were growing. Right? In an economy, when the producer is impacted, the consumer is impacted, and government is impacted, then that's not good economics at all. So, this definitely needed change. Right? That's the idea that we come across. Are we clear? Yes. So, we are looking into what is GST, why GST, and the scenario, how it came to us. Perfect? Yes. Now, we have understood one of the major impact the economy was facing was cascading effect. Hagidre, didn't we bring changes at all till GST orgu? Now, ಏನು changes sarle ilva? Was GST the first change that we brought about? Hagena? Was it the scenario? No. Right? We have brought changes. Right? We'll try and understand them. What are the changes that we have brought about? Okay? Like, the first major reform that was implemented, in this scenario was, what do we call as VAT. Right. The first major reform in the indirect tax scenario, which actually benefited the economy largely, was VAT. Okay. Right. Now, VAT as much as possible tried decreasing the cascading effect. As much as possible, it tried decreasing the cascading effect. Did it completely eliminate? No. But it decreased cascading effect largely. Right? Heg madadru, they introduced an idea called TIN. What is TIN? Tax identification number. Right? They introduced an idea called TIN. So, pratyobba retailer kuda TIN and itkobeku. Right? ಸೊ ಈಗ ಏನ್ GST IN ಅಂತ ನೀವು ಬಿಲ್ಸ್ ಮೇಲೆ ನೋಡ್ತೀರಾ, ಆಗ ಮುಂಚೆ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದೇನು 10, right? Before GST ಬರೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಮುಂಚೆ ಇದೆ 10. So 10 introduce ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. Everybody had to compulsory mention 10. Invoicing was made compulsory. Invoicing ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಬಿಲ್ ಜನರೇಟ್ ಮಾಡೋದು ಕಂಪಲ್ಸರಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, right? With this, the idea of input tax credit was initiated, so that you are collecting tax at multiple levels. So multiple levels of tax cascade ಆಗೋ ಬದಲು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇನ್ಪುಟ್ ಸಿಕ್ಲಿ ಅನ್ನೋ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ, right? So all this were major benefits of VAT. So VAT did benefit in bringing down cascading effect, because the idea of tax identification number, input tax credit, invoicing was made compulsory. All this did benefit. It benefited the economy, right? With cascading effect coming down, naturally, right, tax evasion reduced, right, increased tax collections, benefited the economy largely, right? However, issues continued. It did not completely eliminate, issues continued, right? This system was not very, very simple. It had its own complexities. Further, cascading effect also remained. Cascading effect also remained. So the next major change that we bring about, from here to here was, from VAT we brought what is called a mod VAT. From VAT we brought what is called a mod VAT. Mod VAT is a modified VAT system. Mod VAT is a modified VAT system. Okay, right? Here further ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಏನ್ ಇಂಪ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಇತ್ತು, ಏನ್ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ ಇತ್ತು, ಆ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ ನ ಮಾಡಿಫೈ ಮಾಡಕ್ ಟ್ರೈ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, right? Further decreasing cascading effect. ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಇನ್ಪುಟ್ ಟ್ಯಾಕ್ಸ್ ರೇಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು, ಆ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅನ್ನು ಹೇಗೆ ರೆಕ್ಟಿಫೈ ಮಾಡಬಹುದು, what changes can be brought about, that was also introduced, right? To be specific on a note, in terms of what specific changes that came about in the idea of mod VAT, right? The idea of excise duty specific to manufacturing, sales in terms of VAT, all this was creating trouble. So that changes brought about. So it did not include the idea of service tax. So mod VAT improvised. Okay, the mod VAT came about. So when mod VAT brought a lot of change, it was better than the idea of VAT. But mod VAT also issues persisted. Okay, why? Center is charging its own tax, state is charging its own tax, every state is charging its own tax. So when you talk about input tax credit, who will give to whom? Anno perspectively, respective states to the state tax only, center to the center only. This complexity remained. Things like electricity, manufacturing, these when it happens across the state, right, that further created trouble. So from VAT, mod VAT, we moved across to a system which we call sen VAT. So VAT was retained by states, and then we brought about a system called sen VAT. So this is the transition that you see. So VAT, mod VAT to sen VAT. Sen VAT also was having better benefits. Comparatively, changes were effective. Cascade effect came down as much as possible, but the major idea remained, which was center charging its own taxes, state charging its own taxes, multiple types of taxes. Okay, so multiple types of taxes remained, and center state levels remained. So input tax credit system was not very, very effective, right? Keeping all this in mind, and a long pending demand, we introduce the much necessary reform that came across, and that much necessary reform is the idea of GST, or goods and services tax. Okay, so this is in a simple idea the evolution of GST that has come across. Okay, we'll see the timeline in specific to GST as such, but tax scenario before GST, right? So if you look at this particular idea, we started with asking what is why. So before and after. So when we talked of before, there we saw there were different types of taxes creating multiples collected at multiple level resulting into cascading effect, and that further creating the idea where cascading effect had so many problems. We took a practical scenario where something produced at 20 is going to the consumer at 100, right? The producer is also impacted, the consumer is also impacted, government is also not able to collect tax. Such kind of scenario. Why? Because there was a huge cascading effect. So did we bring reforms? Yes, we brought reforms. Reforms like VAT. In VAT, the major idea was about TIN, about making invoicing compulsory, about input tax credit. All these aspects were brought in. That modified into mod VAT, that into sen VAT. So VAT, mod VAT and sen VAT. This is how the changes go about. Are we clear? VAT, mod VAT and sen VAT. This is how the changes have gone. Are we clear? All of us? Yes? Perfect. So this is the understanding that we have seen. Each stage reform had a correct perspective, reform had a correct idea, but it couldn't solve the problem completely. Right? Effectively, GST has become that one point solution which has solved it permanently. Right? It needed a lot of will, political will, it needed large scale support. The process started as early as 1999 with Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government. Right. So NDA government, UPA government for 10 years and then again NDA government. It has passed through multiple stages where every government has played a very effective role convincing all states, bringing all states into one platform and then implementing the idea of GST. Okay. So that's the idea of how GST came out. This is the scenario before GST. Clear? Yes? All of us?